Imagine a laboratory technician extracting a patient's own immune cells.
Right, just pulling them right out.
Yeah, and then freezing them in this cryogenic vat and shipping them all the way across the country to a highly specialized manufacturing facility.
Which is already, a massive logistical hurdle.
Exactly. And there, scientists use a viral vector to genetically re-engineer those exact cells so they can hunt down a specific protein on the surface of a cancer cell.
Sounds like science fiction, honestly.
It really does.
Yeah.
I mean, they multiply these new, basically assassin cells by the millions, ship them back under strict temperature controls, and infuse them right back into the patient's bloodstream.
Where they essentially cure what would otherwise be a terminal blood cancer.
Right. Now, imagine trying to capture the sheer logistical terror and, the miraculous biology of that entire process on a quarterly corporate spreadsheet.
That is the ultimate challenge, right?
Yeah.
Because the translation of that cutting-edge human biology into cold financial metrics is exactly where the modern healthcare industry lives.
Yeah.
When you look at the balance sheet of a global pharmaceutical and medical technology conglomerate, you're not just looking at revenue.
Or just the profit margins.
Exactly. You are looking at a highly localized map of our fight against complex diseases. I mean, the numbers tell you exactly which biological pathways we are conquering and which defensive battles we're, losing to expiring patents.
Welcome to this deep dive. Our mission today is to unpack a profoundly revealing document for you, and that is the Q1 2026 earnings presentation from Johnson & Johnson.
Dated April 14th, 2026.
Yes, April 14th. And we are completely bypassing the standard, boring readout of the top line billions.
Please, nobody wants to hear just a list of numbers.
Right. Instead, we're using this document to really decode the future of global healthcare for you. We want to show you the rapidly shifting landscape of medical technology.
Like the transition from these massive hospital-based infusions to simple at-home peptides.
Yes, and the macroeconomic forces that are literally shaping how long you live and, frankly, how much it costs to keep you alive.
Because a company operating at this massive scale, it serves as a macroeconomic bellwether. Their Q1 results set the baseline for the entire medical ecosystem.
From the small community oncology clinics all the way up to the sovereign healthcare procurement offices in Beijing.
Right.
So setting the stage with those top-line numbers, just to give us a sense of that sheer scale, for the first quarter of 2026, Johnson & Johnson reported $24.1 billion in worldwide sales.
Wow.
Yeah. That is a reported increase of 9.9% year over year.
Which is huge, but you have to factor in the relentless currency fluctuations a multinational deals with, right?
Exactly. And when you do that, the operational growth sits at an incredibly robust 6.4%.
And just to put that in perspective, moving the needle 6.4% on a $24 billion quarterly base, that requires massive commercial momentum.
Massive. Okay, so let's unpack this. Because reading an earnings report for an enterprise this large, it's kind of akin to standing in the engine room of a massive multi-class ocean liner.
I like that analogy.
Right. You have all these different propulsion systems driving the vessel simultaneously.
Some of them are just humming perfectly.
Yeah. Some of these engines are running at absolute maximum capacity, just burning high-octane innovation. But others are sputtering. They're fighting the massive friction of market gravity.
And then a few are these bleeding-edge prototypes that are just now being switched on and spun up.
Exactly. And we see that divergence when you look under the hood. The GAAP earnings actually plummeted by over 52%.
Wait, 52%?
Yeah, dropping down to $5.2 billion from last year's $11 billion. But, and here's the key, the adjusted operational earnings remained remarkably flat at $6.6 billion.
Showing just a negligible, 1.4% decrease.
Right, so that divergence between the dropping GAAP earnings and the flat adjusted earnings signals something really important.
It means we are looking at a highly transitionary quarter.
Yeah.
The financial friction you're seeing here is literally a collision between two opposing forces. You have this pipeline of highly innovative, incredibly complex new therapies aggressively gaining market share.
Fighting to outpace the rapid erosion of their legacy revenues.
Right. The older blockbuster drugs are falling right off the patent cliff, and they are facing absolutely brutal biosimilar competition. So the company has to run at top speed just to keep those adjusted earnings flat.
Just to tread water while the new pipeline takes over.
Exactly.
And we see that dynamic playing out most aggressively in the largest engine on this ocean liner, which is their innovative medicine segment.
The pharmaceutical division.
Right. This division alone generated $15.4 billion in Q1. That drove an 11.2% reported increase.
Which is staggering.
It is. And the absolute juggernaut carrying this division, the oncology portfolio, that alone pulled in $6.973 billion.
With an operational growth rate of 17.8%. I mean, in the context of large-cap pharma, maintaining nearly 18% growth on a multi-billion-dollar base is practically unheard of.
It really is. It signifies that these therapies are fundamentally altering the standard of care for cancer.
Oh, absolutely. And the multiple myeloma portfolio is the absolute cornerstone of that 17.8% growth.
Yeah, the report heavily emphasizes DARZALEX, which continues to capture significant market share globally.
And it's interesting because the presentation actually notes that this growth occurred despite being partially offset by quarterly inventory dynamics.
Right, which sounds like corporate jargon. What does that actually mean?
So wholesaler purchasing patterns can occasionally make the quarter-to-quarter financial reporting look a little choppy, like maybe a hospital bought a ton of it last quarter and less this quarter.
Ah, okay.
But the underlying prescription volume, the actual patient demand for DARZALEX, that is surging. It has basically become foundational in the treatment paradigm for multiple myeloma.
Which brings us back to the scenario we opened the whole deep dive with, right? The genetic engineering of immune cells.
CARVYKTI.
Exactly. The source data points to CARVYKTI, their CARVY cell therapy for relapsed or refractory multiple myeloma. The growth here is explicitly attributed to, quote, continued site expansion.
And for anyone tracking cell and gene therapies, site expansion is everything. It is the ultimate bottleneck.
Because this isn't a small molecule drug you just manufacture in massive batches and ship out to a local retail pharmacy, right?
No, not at all. The logistics of autologous CAR-T therapies completely dictate the commercial rollout. First, you need specialized apheresis centers to harvest the patient's T cells.
Which is not a simple process.
No, it's intense. And then you need a highly secure cold chain logistics network to transport those living cells to the manufacturing facility.
And then bring them back.
Right. And you need certified academic medical centers equipped to handle the intensive conditioning regimens and, potential adverse events like cytokine release syndrome when the cells are infused back in.
So every single time Johnson & Johnson announces a quote-unquote site expansion for CARVYKTI, they're not just adding a clinic to a list.
No, they are confirming they have successfully certified another major hospital to handle this absolute sci-fi level of medicine.
They are physically expanding the geographic footprint of access.
Exactly.
But, the presentation also highlights a strategic pivot in how they deliver complex care, which I found fascinating.
Oh, the community setting shift.
Yes. When detailing the growth of TECVAYLI and TALVY, which are their bispecific antibodies, the source attributes their launch uptake to expansion in the community setting.
Yeah, that phrase community setting is a critical strategic signal.
Why is that such a big deal?
Well, historically, treating these really complex hematologic malignancies required patients to travel to major academic medical centers.
Right, these massive, centralized research hospitals usually located in major cities.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So for a patient living in a rural or even a suburban area, accessing cutting-edge treatment meant significant travel, a huge expense, and a massive disruption to their life.
The disruption is immense. And from a commercial standpoint, funneling every single patient in a region through one single academic hospital creates an artificial ceiling on your revenue.
You literally cap out.
Right. The physical capacity of that one hospital limits the number of prescriptions you can write.
So by optimizing the administration protocols for TECVAYLI and TALVY, J&J is successfully transitioning these highly complex bispecific antibodies out of those academic hubs.
And right into local, community-based oncology clinics.
Exactly. And shifting the point of care decentralizes the revenue stream. I mean, community oncology networks manage the vast majority of cancer patients globally.
So when a complex therapy receives the necessary clinical backing and safety profile to be given in a local clinic, the total addressable market just expands exponentially.
You're bringing the absolute vanguard of oncology directly into the patient's neighborhood.
That's incredible. And the data pushes that even further with a note about the U.S. FDA's recent approval of a combination therapy.
Right. TECVAYLI plus DARZALEX Faspro.
Yes. And this is the classic, highly lucrative oncology playbook, isn't it?
Oh, 100%. You take one incredibly effective biologic, combine it with another proprietary biologic from your own pipeline, and you run the trials to prove they work better together.
To prove that synergistic effect.
Yep. And once the FDA approves the combination, you establish a completely new standard of care where you own both mechanisms of action.
So you capture the entirety of the therapeutic value chain for that specific patient population.
Exactly. You lock it down. And, the oncology momentum isn't just isolated to blood cancers either.
Right, the solid tumor portfolio is contributing significantly too. The presentation highlights the launch uptake and share gains of Rybrevant and Elciclal-UZ in lung cancer.
Alongside Elenata in metastatic castration-sensitive prostate cancer, or MCSPC.
But of course, the relentless nature of this industry means the momentum is never uniform across the board.
No, there's always a weak spot.
Right. I want to look at the shadow within this portfolio. The report explicitly details a decline in sales for Imbruvica.
Yeah, that stood out to me as well.
And the reasoning provided in the source is pretty clear. They cite share loss due to continued competitive pressure and unfavorable patient mix.
Which is fascinating because Imbruvica was a completely revolutionary Bruton's tyrosine kinase, or BTK, inhibitor. It completely transformed the treatment of chronic lymphocytic leukemia.
So if it was so revolutionary, why is it losing ground?
Well, the decline of Imbruvica just brilliantly illustrates the brutal efficiency of the pharmaceutical market. The moment a company validates a novel biological target.
Like the BTK pathway.
Exactly. The moment you prove that works, competitors deploy massive resources to engineer second and third generation molecules.
To hit that exact same target.
Right, but maybe with slightly improved efficacy or, a cleaner side effect profile.
But the newer entrants just capture all the new patient starts, creating immediate competitive pressure.
Precisely. And that phrase, unfavorable patient mix.
Yeah, what does that indicate?
That usually means the patients remaining on the legacy drug may fall under payer contracts with much heavier rebates or discounts.
So it erodes the profit margin on the volume that actually remains.
Exactly. You are forced to innovate because the market will inevitably dismantle your previous innovations.
Which serves as a perfect analytical bridge to their immunology division, because the concept of market gravity and competitive pressure is completely defining their current reality in this sector.
Oh, absolutely. They're on the defensive there.
Yeah. For Q1, the immunology segment actually contracted by 8.8% in reported sales, falling to $3.38 billion.
And the primary culprit for that contraction is spelled out plainly in the presentation.
Stelara.
Stelara.
Yeah.
It created a massive 920 basis point headwind for the worldwide innovative medicine division.
Which is wild. For a single drug to create a 9.2% drag on a $15 billion portfolio, the underlying market dynamics have to be shifting violently.
And they are. Stelara has been a cornerstone biologic for psoriasis and inflammatory bowel disease for years, but it has officially hit the patent cliff.
Meaning the exclusivity is gone.
Exactly. And the patent expiration of a complex biologic triggers the entry of biosimilars.
Now, biosimilars aren't exactly the same as regular generic drugs, right?
Right. Unlike small molecule generics, which are perfect, exact chemical copies, biosimilars are highly similar versions of the original large protein molecule.
Because biologics are grown in living cells, so you can't perfectly replicate them.
Exactly. While they do require extensive clinical validation to prove they have no clinically meaningful differences from the reference product, once they clear those regulatory hurdles, they enter the market at a significantly lower price point.
And pharmacy benefit managers and national health systems aggressively transition their patient populations to these biosimilars to control their drug spend.
It's all about cost saving for them. And the presentation notes that Stelara is facing intense biosimilar competition alongside the increasing adoption of entirely novel classes of competing therapies.
And we see this exact same defensive posture with their older legacy biologics too, right? Simponi and Remicade are facing similar downward pressure.
They are. But the corporate strategy here cannot simply rely on defending legacy products. You can't just build a moat.
You have to launch counteroffensives.
Exactly. And the source points to Tremfya as a key growth driver, highlighting significant launch momentum in the inflammatory bowel disease space.
Tremfya represents their attempt to capture the patients migrating away from those older biologics.
Right. Keep them in the J&J family.
But here's where it gets really interesting. The absolute standout feature of the entire immunology presentation.
Oh, new approval.
Yes. And arguably the most consequential strategic move in the quarter. The spotlight on the U.S. FDA approval of ICOTYDE.
Chemically known as icotrokinra.
Right. The presentation emphasizes that it is the first and only IL-23R targeted oral peptide approved for moderate to severe plaque psoriasis in patients 12 and older.
And the pharmacological distinction here is paramount. We're looking at a major transition.
From the large, complex monoclonal antibodies that must be injected or infused.
To a targeted peptide formulated as a simple, once-daily oral pill.
But the true disruptor, in my opinion, is the clinical profile they highlighted in the source data.
The safety profile is incredible.
They boldly emphasize that prescribing ICOTYDE requires absolutely no mandatory tuberculosis testing and no ongoing laboratory monitoring.
Which is a game changer. For anyone outside the dermatology or rheumatology fields, the absence of a TB test might sound like, I don't know, a minor logistical detail.
Right, who cares about one less test?
Exactly. But within the context of systemic immunosuppression, it represents a massive leap forward in the standard of care.
Explain why the TB test is normally so critical with these biologics.
Sure. So traditional biologic therapies for severe plaque psoriasis work by broadly dampening specific inflammatory pathways.
They turn down the immune system to stop the skin inflammation.
Exactly. But while they're highly effective at clearing the skin, this systemic dampening can compromise the immune system's overall ability to keep latent infections in check.
Okay.
And a really significant percentage of the global population actually carries dormant tuberculosis bacteria, safely walled off by their immune system.
Oh, wow. So they have it, but they aren't sick.
Right. But when you administer a heavy biologic, you risk suppressing the immune response enough that the latent TB reactivates.
Turning a skin condition treatment into a literally life-threatening pulmonary crisis.
Exactly. Consequently, prescribing legacy biologics mandates rigorous upfront blood work, tuberculosis screening, and continuous laboratory monitoring to track liver enzymes and white blood cell counts.
That sounds like a massive administrative burden for the physician.
It is, and significant friction for the patient, too. Nobody wants to go in for constant blood draws.
So by engineering a highly targeted oral peptide that completely bypasses the need for TB testing and lab monitoring, J&J is fundamentally altering the friction points of treatment.
Radically. A dermatologist can diagnose severe psoriasis and just hand the patient a prescription for a daily pill in a single visit.
Without coordinating with diagnostic labs or scheduling follow-up blood draws.
It is the ultimate expression of convenience acting as a medical breakthrough.
However, an aggressive rollout of a highly convenient oral pill directly threatens their own multi-billion-dollar injectable biologic franchise, doesn't it?
Oh, totally. J&J is actively engineering the obsolescence of its own older products.
Which seems crazy, but it's a strategic imperative. The cannibalization is the point.
Exactly. If patient's going to transition off an aging J&J biologic anyway.
Due to convenience or that biosimilar pressure we talked about?
Right. J&J must ensure that patient transitions to a newer J&J product, like ICOTYDE.
Rather than a competitor's novel oral therapy, you have to aggressively disrupt your own revenue streams before the broader market does it for you.
Yep. Disrupt yourself or die.
And we see that aggressive forward-leaning posture amplified in segment 3, their neuroscience portfolio.
Now, this is where the momentum really shifts.
Yeah, because while immunology is managing the friction of a defensive transition, neuroscience is executing a massive offensive expansion. The sector posted a staggering 32% reported growth rate.
Accelerating to $2.175 billion for the quarter.
And a 32% growth rate in a really mature therapeutic area like central nervous system disorders. That indicates a fundamental shift in prescribing behavior.
It really does. And the earnings presentation highlights Spravato, their esketamine nasal spray, noting continued increases in both physician and patient demand.
And Spravato represents a complete paradigm shift away from the legacy mechanisms of treating depression, right?
Completely. For decades, the standard of care relied heavily on selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or SSRIs.
Your classic antidepressants.
Right. And while effective for many people, SSRIs can take weeks to alter neurochemistry sufficiently to show clinical benefit.
And they often fail to induce remission in a massive cohort of patients.
Exactly. Spravato, on the other hand, targets the glutamate system, specifically the NMDA receptors.
Offering rapid-acting relief.
Yes, sometimes within hours, for treatment-resistant depression.
That is incredible. The surge in demand clearly reflects the sheer volume of patients who have exhausted traditional oral antidepressants and just require a different mechanistic approach entirely.
And furthermore, the portfolio strength is bolstered by Caplyta, which the source notes is experiencing strong momentum in the AMDD launch.
Now, for context for you listening, AMDD stands for Adjunctive Major Depressive Disorder.
And securing an FDA label for adjunctive use is a massive commercial unlock.
Because it means psychiatrists can prescribe Caplyta alongside a patient's existing antidepressant regimen to basically boost efficacy when the primary medication isn't achieving full remission.
Right. The addressable market for an adjunctive therapy is vastly larger than for a standalone first-line treatment because you can layer it on top.
That makes total sense, but the real anchor of the neuroscience growth, looking at the numbers, lies in the Invega franchise.
Their suite of long-acting injectables for schizophrenia.
Right. The portfolio includes Sustenna, Trinza, Hafira, Execleon, and Travicta, and the source attributes the strong performance here to a, quote, favorable patient mix.
There's that phrase again.
Yeah, and that phrase, favorable patient mix, often obscures the clinical reality happening on the ground, doesn't it?
It really does, because treating schizophrenia presents one of the most difficult medication adherence challenges in modern medicine.
The very nature of the disorder frequently leads patients to discontinue daily oral medications,
Which results in devastating relapses, psychiatric hospitalizations, and severe cognitive decline over time.
So the pharmacology of the Invega suite addresses that adherence crisis through extended-release formulations.
Exactly. Sustenna provides 1 full month of therapeutic coverage per injection.
Trinza extends that to 3 months.
And Hafira pushes the boundary to a single injection every 6 months.
Which is astounding. From a clinical perspective, guaranteeing medication adherence for half a year with a single dose is completely transformative for patient stability.
And from the corporate perspective, that clinical stability directly translates to the favorable patient mix.
Right, because the longer-acting formulations carry a higher price point and a stronger profit margin.
Exactly. As physicians successfully transition stable patients from the 1-month injections up the ladder to the 3-month and 6-month versions, the overall profitability of that patient cohort increases.
It is a really rare alignment where the most advanced, highest margin product directly correlates with the absolute best long-term outcome for the patient's quality of life.
It's a win-win, really. Now, before we pivot away from the pharmaceutical data entirely, the presentation does include this $2.899 billion other category.
Yeah, the other.
Right. And while it serves as a catch-all for various medicines, the scale of it is larger than the entire neuroscience division.
It's huge, and the dynamics in the segment really mirror the broader portfolio. They note growth drivers like Uptravi, navigating some inventory dynamics there as well.
The UMAT and OPSYNVI franchise in pulmonary arterial hypertension.
And the Prezista and Simtuzisa family of HIV therapeutics. But conversely, they acknowledge the continued share erosion of Xarelto.
Yeah, the anticoagulant market is fiercely competitive right now.
And older branded blood thinners like Xarelto inevitably bleed market share, no pun intended, as newer generation therapies and generic equivalents saturate the prescribing pathways.
The life cycle of a pharmaceutical asset is finite. You discover it, you scale it, you defend it, and eventually you watch it erode.
Which is exactly why a conglomerate structure is so vital for a company like this. When the biochemical innovations face friction, the physical hardware divisions provide stabilization.
It's the ultimate diversification.
Right. So let's transition our focus to that hardware. We have spent the first half of this analysis entirely in the realm of biochemistry.
Peptides, antibodies, viral vectors.
Exactly. But human biology eventually breaks down in ways that chemistry simply cannot fix. You need mechanical intervention.
You need tools.
And the MedTech division reported $8.6 billion in sales, achieving a 4.6% operational growth rate.
Generating 4.6% growth in a highly mature, heavily capital-intensive hardware market demonstrates really strong execution.
Particularly within cardiovascular, surgery, and vision.
Yeah, looking at the cardiovascular segment, the technologies listed in the presentation sound like the manifest of a deep space exploration vessel.
They really do. They highlight the Veripulse platform, the dual energy thermocool SmartTouch SF,
The Impella heart pump?
ONNY Pulsi, and the Shockwave intravascular lithotripsy system.
The evolution of cardiovascular intervention is heavily reliant on miniaturized physics.
Give me an example of that.
Well, the shockwave intravascular lithotripsy is a perfect example of adapting established physics to solve a critical surgical bottleneck.
Okay, unpack that for me. How does it work?
Historically, if a patient presented with severe coronary artery disease, but it was complicated by heavily calcified plaque.
Meaning the blockages in the heart arteries were basically hardened like bone.
Exactly. Traditional angioplasty in those cases was incredibly high risk because inflating a standard high-pressure balloon inside a rigid calcified artery could cause that calcium to tear the vessel wall.
Which leads to catastrophic dissection, a major emergency.
Right, so the shockwave technology elegantly bypasses this danger. It utilizes sonic pressure waves.
So sound waves.
Yeah, essentially miniaturizing the lithotripsy technology used for decades to break up kidney stones.
Oh, wow.
And it delivers those sound waves through a tiny catheter directly into the coronary artery.
So the sonic waves fracture the calcium deposits within the artery wall without causing trauma to the soft tissue around it.
Exactly. It breaks up the hard stuff and leaves the soft stuff alone. And once that rigid calcium is cracked, the surgeon can safely deploy a stent to restore blood flow.
It fundamentally alters the risk profile for treating complex calcified lesions. That is amazing.
It is. And MedTech growth is also supported by the Vision division.
Right, where the ACUV, OACY's one-day family of contact lenses and the Technis premium intraocular lenses.
Specifically the Odyssey and Pure C lines used in cataract surgery.
Yeah, those are driving massive volume. The presentation actually notes this growth is occurring despite U.S. competitive pressures.
Which just speaks to the relentless baseline demand for optical correction globally. People need to see.
However, the most analytically vital data point in the MedTech segment surfaces within the surgery sector, and it's not a positive one.
Right. While biosurgery grew by approximately 5% and wound closure saw success with barbed and PLOS sutures, the presentation explicitly names a recurring macroeconomic headwind.
One that is severely muting the performance of endocutters and energy devices. Sales for endocutters, which are essentially high-tech surgical stapling devices, declined by roughly 3%.
And energy device growth was throttled to about 2%.
And the explicit reason provided across these surgical lines is, quote, VBP in China.
And for anyone tracking the intersection of geopolitics and healthcare economics, VBP has become the ultimate disruptor.
VBP stands for volume-based procurement.
Right. It represents a total paradigm shift in how sovereign nations manage their medical supply chain costs.
Because as China's population ages rapidly and the demand on their healthcare infrastructure just explodes, the national government recognized the unsustainability of traditional procurement.
The old fragmented way, where every single hospital negotiated its own pricing for surgical supplies.
Right. The solution was to centralize the purchasing power of the state. The government now orchestrates massive reverse auctions.
They approach global manufacturers and state their intent to purchase just an astronomical volume of a specific device, like, say, 10 million surgical endocutters.
And they offer to lock in that massive volume contract, but the contract goes to the manufacturer willing to submit the absolute lowest bid.
And the resulting price compression is severe. We are looking at mandated price reductions of 60%, 70%, sometimes over 80% overnight.
Wow. So if a global player like J&J wins the VBP contract, their surgical device volume in China skyrockets, but their profit margin on those exact devices essentially collapses to the floor.
Exactly. And if they refuse to match the rock-bottom bids of local Chinese manufacturers, they risk being locked out of those regional markets entirely.
It's a brutal catch-22. When the earnings presentation cites VBP in China as a 3% drag on global endocutter sales, it is a stark reminder that macroeconomic policy can instantly erase the margins of world-class medical engineering.
Oh, without a doubt.
You can manufacture the most reliable surgical stapler on the planet, but if a sovereign government rewrites the rules of the marketplace, the financial impact is immediate and unavoidable.
So to counteract that margin compression in basic surgical tools, companies push heavily into complex, high-margin capital equipment.
Things you can't easily reverse auction.
Exactly. And we see this in the presentation's focus on robotics and orthopedics. They highlight the ICOTYDE robotic surgical system and the Monarch platform.
Because the integration between the robotics and the implants is where the long-term margin is secured. The presentation connects the robotics directly to their orthopedic solutions.
Right. The emphasis system for hips and the Attune and VELYS robotic-assisted solutions for knee replacements.
The strategy here is moving way beyond just selling a piece of titanium. They're selling an integrated surgical ecosystem.
Yeah, the VELYS system acts as a sophisticated robotic assistant. It analyzes the unique anatomy of the patient's knee, and it actually guides the surgeon to make hyper-precise bone cuts.
And the catch is, The robotic system is specifically calibrated to perfectly seat the AT2 knee implant.
Right. It is the classic razor and blade business model, just elevated to multi-million-dollar capital equipment and titanium prosthetics.
So if a hospital network invests heavily in acquiring the VLOAS robotic systems, and they spend the time training their surgical staff on the software,
They are functionally locked into purchasing the AT implants that integrate with that robot.
the hardware drives the surgical precision, but the software ecosystem drives the recurring implant revenue.
It's brilliant from a business standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
But, assessing the sheer breadth of this entire portfolio, from the sonic catheters and robotic arms to the bispecific antibodies and oral peptides,
It forces a structural question about the nature of research and development. The capital required to maintain world-class expertise across entirely disparate fields of physics, biology, and chemistry. It's incalculable.
nobody can do it all internally.
Which brings us to the architecture of how these technologies actually make it to the quarterly earnings report in the first place.
The partnerships.
Yes, if you look at the collaborations slide in the presentation, it completely dispels the romanticized myth of the modern pharmaceutical industry.
Because there is this pervasive public narrative of a massive corporate laboratory where thousands of internal J&J scientists invent every single breakthrough from scratch, completely isolated from the outside world.
Right, the lone genius in the lab coat.
Exactly. But the modern megacat healthcare company operates entirely differently. The complexity of mapping novel genetic pathways or engineering localized viral vectors has just become way too specialized for any single entity to dominate.
The groundbreaking discoveries are frequently made in highly agile, narrowly focused biotech startups or within university research facilities.
And the collaboration slide reads like a roll call of that global biotech ecosystem.
It really does. In oncology, Imbruvica is co-marketed with Pharmacyclics, which is an AbbVie company. DARZALEX and Rebrevant utilize antibody technology licensed from Genmab.
CARVYKTI, the incredibly complex cell therapy we discussed at the very beginning, that was developed in collaboration with Legend Biotech.
LAZCLUZE relies on licensing from Yuhan Corporation.
And the structure is identical across all the other divisions, too. Immunology leans on partnerships with Merck and Mitsubishi Tanabe for legacy products.
And what about ICOTYDE, that revolutionary oral peptide we talked about?
Discovered in collaboration with Protagonist Therapeutics.
Wow. And the neuroscience injectables involve technology licenses from Alkermes, while the HIV and anticoagulant lines leverage partnerships with Gilead and Bayer.
So J&J functions less as an isolated laboratory and much more as a massive commercialization, clinical scaling, and regulatory engine.
A brilliant team of researchers at a university like the Regents of California who hold licenses related to Erleada might identify a potent new molecule.
Or a startup like Legend Biotech might engineer a brilliant cardiac architecture.
But these smaller entities lack the billions of dollars in highly liquid capital required to fund global phase 3 clinical trials across tens of thousands of patients.
They also lack the established relationships with international regulatory bodies.
The global cold chain logistics networks we talked about?
Exactly. And the vast commercial sales forces required to negotiate formulary placements with European health ministries or to educate thousands of community oncologists.
So the partnerships are completely symbiotic. The smaller biotech firms provide the bleeding-edge scientific spark.
And J&J provides the capital fuel and the massive corporate engine required to drive that spark to global commercialization.
The financial structures of these deals, the upfront milestone payments upon FDA approval, tiered royalty rates on net sales, and global profit-sharing agreements.
Those are the invisible framework really supporting the $24.1 billion top-line revenue.
Which leads directly into the final analytical layer of the presentation. A sprawling global pipeline built on intricate licensing deals, vulnerable supply chains, and sovereign procurement policies carries an immense matrix of risk.
Every earnings presentation concludes with a dense section of forward-looking statements.
The fine print.
The fine print. And while legally mandated to protect the company from shareholder litigation regarding future projections, reading between the lines of these legal disclaimers provides a highly accurate map of the executive board's systemic anxieties.
The risks they are legally obligated to disclose are not theoretical. They are the exact friction points we've traced throughout this deep dive.
Right. They lead by warning investors about economic factors, specifically pointing to currency exchange rate fluctuations.
And we saw the immediate impact of this in their opening metrics, right? A strong U.S. dollar shaving the operational growth from 9.9% down to 6.4%.
Exactly. And then they explicitly warn about, quote, technological advances, new products, and patents attained by competitors.
That is the precise dynamic eroding the market share of Imbruvica and forcing the defensive cannibalization strategy with Stelara and ICOTYDE.
The law of pharmaceutical gravity dictates that if you build a lucrative biological market, a competitor is already engineering a sharper, safer molecule to take it right from you.
Then they detail the risks of manufacturing difficulties or delays internally or within the supply chain.
Which is huge for biologics. When you are extracting a patient's T cells, engineering them, and shipping them back, the supply chain is terrifyingly fragile.
A temperature excursion during transit or a manufacturing bottleneck at a specialized viral vector facility doesn't just delay recognizing revenue.
No, it fundamentally jeopardizes a patient's survival.
They also highlight the increasing vulnerability to scrutiny of the healthcare industry by government agencies and macro trends toward healthcare cost containment.
Which is that China VBP reverse option dynamic expanding globally.
Right, between the aggressive centralized procurement in Asia, stringent cost-effectiveness evaluations in European markets, and the shifting legislative landscape around Medicare drug price negotiations in the United States.
Sovereign governments are actively deploying their legislative power to compress healthcare margins.
Finally, they note the operational risks surrounding the separation of their orthopedics business or other major restructuring efforts.
It serves as a stark reminder that managing an enterprise of this scale requires orchestrating immense corporate reorganizations while simultaneously trying to cure cancer.
The sheer complexity is staggering. Over the course of this deep dive, we have mapped the massive divergence between a $5.2 billion JAP reality and the robust underlying operational growth.
We have traced the brutal life cycle of blockbuster drugs, seeing how a revolutionary treatment eventually succumbs to biosimilar pressure and the relentless pace of competitive pharmacology.
We have analyzed the geopolitical forces of centralized procurement stripping hardware margins in China.
And the intricate global spiderweb of biotech partnerships required to keep the innovation pipeline flowing.
Synthesizing this massive Q1 presentation down to its core, a unifying theme really emerges. Whether you are an institutional investor allocating capital, a clinic director managing a community oncology practice, or a patient navigating a complex diagnosis.
The future of medicine is defined by a high-speed race between expiring intellectual property and the relentless pursuit of reduced friction.
The overarching trajectory of the most innovative therapies, like the Tecvayli bispecific antibodies and the ICOTYDE oral peptide, is the aggressive decentralization of complex care.
We are witnessing a systemic shift away from the legacy model of confining advanced treatments to specialized academic hospitals and intensive, heavily monitored IV infusions.
We are moving the bleeding edge of human biology into local community clinics and compressing complex immunology into simple at-home daily pills.
The ultimate medical breakthrough isn't just efficacy anymore, it's convenience.
Which leaves us with a profound structural question to ponder as we close.
Yeah, if the relentless drive of pharmaceutical engineering is making the most advanced treatments in the world exponentially easier to administer.
If you can take your psoriasis peptide at your kitchen table and receive your bispecific antibody at a local strip mall clinic,
how will the sprawling, capital-intensive physical infrastructure of our legacy hospital systems have to adapt or shrink to survive this wave of decentralized convenience?
It is a massive question for the future of healthcare infrastructure. Every number on the Q1 ledger we explored today is ultimately a reflection of that shifting reality.
A metric tied to a patient's experience, a physician's protocol, and the evolving economics of survival.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the numbers, the science, and the strategy behind them. We will see you next time.